Andreessen Horowitz did not just forget how to invest correctly. They're going through something that we're going to discover today that I think explains a lot about their latest strategy when it comes to some of those questionable investments. First of all, Andreessen Horowitz are two real people. It's not just a random name for the company if you are not aware. So we have Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen, essentially two co-founders of the fund. And their story started back in the Netscape days on Mozilla. Some of you might have even heard of it or used the Mozilla before. That was, I think, the OG, one of the first, if not the first browser that was developed in the internet boom era. And so both, again, Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, they met at this company, ended up selling it to AOL, if I recall correctly, and essentially from then on out went on to become investors of their own, primarily because they did not believe the then way of approaching VC investment where the VCs would just write a check and kind of like will be quote unquote useless. They wanted to partake and be more active in the management of their portfolio companies. And the portfolio companies they did. They essentially went on this tear, and when it comes to raising funds, starting with the very first fund back in 2009, it's like what, probably $1 billion plus with the current evaluation at the current times. But they started with the 300 million and rapidly went into the billions of dollars. And the only time you see them dipping under a B number is usually when they try out the new type of fund, right? If they're trying to pursue new area and explore it, they usually go with less than $1 billion and then quickly go above that bracket with acceptance of cultural leadership, which is funny. I have explanation for this, but we're not going to dive into it today. But the whole idea is that the company has been growing. And if you're curious about like, hey, but who did they invest in? Like, I've heard this name before, a16z, Andreessen Horowitz. What are they doing? And if we look all the way back, I've kind of like sorted it in the recency order, right? Whatever. Yeah, proximity to today. I don't know. pick your equivalent. You can see some, names out there that either been hot, remained hot, or like Slack got acquired, right? And Facebook including, which is usually one of the ways they kind of like get their name out there to remind people that they're one of the first ones to invest in Facebook, Airbnb, Pinterest. So they've been around for a little while and they've been growing. As you can see, their portfolio of companies have been growing. There are a lot of companies that you recognize, a lot of companies you've never heard of because they're probably still somewhere in the stages of the development or already got merged with some other brand. And that required them also to start growing the team. And essentially, as you can see, this is not your standard VC size team where VC companies sometimes will have like 10 to 20 people only. We're talking about of hundreds of people. The run rate alone on this type of staff, assuming I can guess and predict how much all of these folks are getting paid to support all of these companies, we're probably talking about tens of millions of dollars. And whatever the 2% or whatever they're charging on the funds that they raised, I don't know if that's enough necessarily in long term to sustain this size of the team. And that's where you start kind of like winding it into the whole conversation around where we are today with kind of like a16z's reputation and whether they lost their ways or do they still remember how to invest in the companies. And the reason being like there've been some high profile failures in the past 10 years for the company, right? And there's some examples like, again, like Jawbone, like Quibi, right? When they raised hundreds of millions of dollars and essentially didn't find the product market fit. And the product market fit became a big theme across some of the investments that they've failed at, because then even if you look at something like BP or you look at something like Fab.com, you can argue that technologically and operationally they didn't support them. But I think in reality, those problems can go away if you have the product market fit and you manage to grow the revenue side of things, right? Then you can just like buy your way through revenue out of any kind of like operational problems. But operational problems will drag you down when you're not making enough money to actually pay for improved operations, if it makes sense. And yes, they also had this guy. I mean, if you haven't known it, ignore me. But I did make a pretty extensive video back in the day. I was, optimistic about the potential for the Clubhouse. So I'll admit, we're all human. We all make mistakes. But from the perspective of specifically Andreessen Horowitz, you start kind of like catching this trend of like, okay, we have these massive investments that are not necessarily panning out. We're not necessarily hearing the stories about any major, companies like Facebook coming out of their investment portfolio. And then you have this massive pivot from them when it comes to investments in crypto a few years back, right? And again, they've lost a bunch of money during the crypto winter. They invested in Solana. That was the whole story. OpenSea pretty much failed when with the whole situation around failure in NFT, which I still think will be okay. Yes, I'm still a fan of NFTs. I know, but I just like the technology when it comes to blockchain. But I get it. There's rightfully so a lot of negative stigma. Long story short, you have this kind of like pattern now emerging, right? When it comes to, okay, for the past 10 years, you hear more about a16z's failures than you hear successes. And then you also hear about stories like this, where they go and they essentially invest in Adam Newman's new project called Flow, which is by some arguments pretty much just like a SaaS tool that no one really needed to help you manage your rentals. But again, they've put a bunch of money behind it, right? They've put almost, between the two investments, close to $500 million. And if you don't recall who Newman was actually the founder of the famous WeWork that grew to, at some point, to $47 billion to then eventually land in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And so you look kind of like, again, at this pattern of like, wait a second, you have this string of failures. You did the whole crypto thing, and in some cases funded rug pulls in the crypto. And now you're investing almost $500 million in a dude who pretty much screwed over the massive company that he've built that then kind of like crashed and burned. WeWork are still around, but it's nowhere near close to the glory days, right? And you start asking rightful questions like, what are you doing? How are you thinking about it? All while, instead of addressing those issues, you have at least Mark Andreessen, who is essentially kind of like a brand ambassador and like a spokesperson. He's obviously one of the co-owners. His name is above the door, so to speak. But he's technically there kind of like a media person, PR person who's out there. And Ben Horowitz, you rarely hear from him because he primarily is CEO and he manages the day-to-day operations. And Mark Andreessen went on this tear of like writing, again, what I call like hyper capitalism papers, right? About techno optimism, about how all of these like regulation, bureaucracy, it's all kind of like slowing us down. And critics who are trying to say that we're doing too much now with AI, they're essentially all wrong and they should let us do whatever we want to do. Why this matters? First, it's because of the fact that Mark Andreessen was one of those critics of the Biden administration here in the United States that was trying to heavily regulate the tech world, at least from the perspective of the pace of some of the innovations, that he has ended up flipping essentially and supporting Donald Trump because he thought that Donald Trump will be more friendly to their efforts. Now we went through all of this, but why does it matter? Like, what is the pattern here that you're trying to point out? What I'm really trying to get to is that there is a logic behind why they now have to go with these kind of like crazy projects, go all in on AI, all in on crypto in the past, bet on someone like Newman. Newman is a great example where I think the read there from them is that he's a kind of polarizing figure that has that gravitational pull that, at least out of curiosity, people will check out the companies. At least out of curiosity, maybe there's idea that will spark something that's going to allow them to hit the level of the WeWork valuations and quickly exit before the entire thing crashes and burns. And it's been kind of like an ongoing criticism of them as an organization, right? Like with the rug pulls in the crypto, with some of the other companies in the past where, at least in the investment world, there was a perception that, okay, a16z just like tries to find someone to carry their bag right before the whole thing crumbles, right? So they're always about that timing. And so you can kind of like look at that. But you can also look and say, back at the size of the company and the organization that they have to support right now, you no longer can survive based on like these like 2x, 3x bets, $100 million each, right? Like they're probably going to burn through $100 million in like a year operation, maybe a little bit less, but with all the PR and marketing and all the stuff that they need to do potentially, right? It's not that significant. So you need to be looking for billions of dollars in returns annually. And so you can no longer just place small bets on smaller companies and hope they succeed. At this scale, at this level, at the position that you took in the industry, thanks to all the success that you've seen in the past, you now have to make those like, crazy, put everything on a zero, put like, a bunch of money on a single number and hope that the spin of the roulette will let you hit essentially the jackpot. And because of this, you now see them go into the crypto. You see them go into the AI and making crazy bets. And this is why you also see this allergic reaction from Mark Andreessen when it comes to any kind of regulation, because regulatory environment prevents you from growing maybe as fast as you want. They want to grow unregulated, because again, they want to get to the point where they can exit and not have to necessarily solve all these problems that they're going to create, say with AI. They want to go invest, build this amazing company, fire everyone, make a bunch of money, exit, and then government, peace out. You guys figure out what you're going to do with all those unemployed people. Because he's one of those spoken critics against universal basic income, right? And so you have this emerging, the pattern basically emerges when you start thinking about it, is that they're very much right now in a position where they can no longer sustain themselves on the regular operation. They need those crazy bets. They need those wild bets. So they go for humans. They go for those technologies. And so because of this, you see this pattern of them essentially losing their ability to bet small and have those small bets fail, which are not as high profile, not as noticeable. And when it pops, right? Like you win big. It's kind of like, again, this old school VC world. And also, I think from the perspective of their mandate when it comes to this, they're kind of like living this world between the VC and private equity, where they kind of have all these resource when it comes to like legal, operating expenses, marketing, all those kind of things, go to market, that they bring to their portfolio companies to help them grow. But I feel like in the world, and especially you see with some of those companies, high profile companies that failed, the transition period between where this company hits like $100 million in ARR, when they're like, a few hundred, 500 plus employees, they reach that place where you can no longer just like put the money in the furnace and burn it. And that's how you're going to keep the company going. Now you need to have great product market fit. You need to be operationally sustainable. You need to be smart about how you grow. And it doesn't seem like that's their forte. Their forte is identifying those interesting opportunities, bet big, and hope it's going to work out. It's not necessarily managing the operations. And this is why I'm comparing, kind of like I'm saying there, between VC world and the PE world, because they don't take the full ownership of the company, which PE would do. And some PE shops have very skilled operating teams that are going to then clean up the company and put it in a great place right before the IPO or any other kind of like a liquidity event. For these guys, they kind of do that, but they're not taking the full control, so they're not really that deeply engaged in the day-to-day. They still just kind of like parachute in probably once a quarter, a few of their folks for the board meeting, and that's how they kind of like influence it. Again, my suspicion, right? I don't know any of the founders who took an investment from a16z to confirm the level of engagement from them, but this is my perception. And so this is where I came into this video. Primarily, this idea of this video was on the list for like a year plus, I think, right as they were talking more and more again about the flow and the Newman. I was like, what are they doing? Like, you see the crypto and all stuff. Yeah, I rolled my eyes, like a bunch of people did that. But like, now you're also going to the guy who screwed over a bunch of investors and really mismanaged the company. You're saying, this is my dude, I'm going to give him another $500 million. And I had that, and I had to simmer in it, and I had to think about it, read up about a16z, understand a little bit of their background. They're great operators, at least they used to be when they used to manage their own company, right? Like, so there's a kernel of the truth. And I also, things that they talk about, I agree with, right? From the perspective of like, VC as a vehicle of investment is useful, but it has its limited use, right? From the perspective of the fact that they are not actively involved in business management. And again, I've said it before in the prior videos, I'm an operator. I have my biases, and rightfully so, my biases are towards experience operations. Like, I have high level of expectation when it comes to the efficiency of operations within the organizations, right? So I understand my bias. So when I see people who are purely investors and they, again, show up once a quarter and try to tell you how to run the company without understanding all the intricacies in it, I'll have my opinions on those people. And so that's where I think them trying to have this like, will they, won't they be deep in operations kind of like format mixed with large size of the company, mixed with the fact that right now the investment world in general is kind of like tough to land when it comes to like finding an interesting company and then be able to exit it, because again, a lot of companies are not acquiring, a lot of companies are not ready for the IPO market is not that hot outside of maybe someone like SpaceX, right? Or maybe OpenAI. So they're between a rock and a hard place, and they're bloat when it comes to, respectfully so, they're bloat from the balance sheet when it comes to managing so many people on the team and carrying so much weight. It made them this very heavy cruiser that's now hard to navigate in the waters that require a lot more nimble ship. I'll end it on this metaphor. I'll stop there before I create some weird metaphor. But this is where it's coming from. So I think a lot of their issues, again, I don't think they forgot how to invest, right? I have my criticism of their ideas and say, but it's not here, not there, right? Like, we're all individuals. We should be able to express our ideas, and sometimes we agree with each other, sometimes we disagree. Who cares? But when it comes to the actual investments, again, their desire and their need to have those massive bets pay off, I think, skewed a little bit their decision making and the filters when it comes to the kind of companies they pursue, the kind of opportunities they pursue. And some of these political statements and investments are very self-serving, because again, they're trying to create an environment that will help them realize those bets. Is it right? I don't think so. I think they created their own problem, and now they're trying to drag a lot of people into it, knowingly or unknowingly. But also from the perspective of like how it all came together, it makes sense. Again, I can judge, you can judge, we cannot judge, right? Like, it's our choice. I think it just looking into this situation deeper gave me a slightly different perspective on how I think about it, and also understanding that like those are very common mistakes that you see in the business, right? Like growing to the level where it's much harder for you to navigate the waters. You're much slower to react to the changes. And so you become kind of like this company that starts making more and more mistakes, not because, again, you have less of skilled people, the people who you have on board, so to speak. Okay, I'm sticking with the metaphor. People who you have on board on that boat, they're still equally skilled. They're still amazing. They still know what they're doing, hopefully for the most part, right? Like, but it's the weight of the ship that you now have to turn is so much bigger, and it's so much harder for you to do so, right? So it's again, do I have like a very strict conclusion on like, oh, what's going to happen? We'll see if they land any massive, bets that are going to pan out, because if they don't, I would not be surprised if they'll start trimming the size of the company and trying to kind of like reset a little bit the way they manage it. But also with their, participation in politics, participation in media, they have our YouTube channels, they have their own podcasts and whatnot. I think they're just trying to figure out their own way through this that might not have the more common answer where like, oh, we're just more nimble company, still managing the investment, still in the space. They might just evolve as a company itself, right? Having those media arms, having those lobbying arms. And that's going to be an interesting one. Again, I don't know if it's a successful failing strategy. It really depends also on macroeconomic climate and where the economy will be, and will there be market for more IPOs and more acquisitions. But for now, at least, it was interesting educational exercise for me to go through that evolution of this company and kind of like look at it and peek a little bit behind the curtain. And I hope it was useful for you. And I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.